Question number 39. Is it a good interpretation to say that the story of Abraham attempting to sacrifice his son illustrates God sending his son as a sacrifice for humanity? Okay, so if you remember, I think it was question number 37, we were talking about a type. Maybe it was question number 37. No, I think it was question number 37. We're talking about what is a type and what is typology. And you remember I was talking about a type is something that is a person, event, or place in the Old Testament that has like a New Testament counterpart, and that this is therefore an illustration of that. Okay? And so this is actually a type that we've got going on tonight. And so let's take a look at Genesis chapter 22. And we're also going to go over to look at Hebrews chapter 11 too. But let's take a look at Genesis chapter 22, and let's kind of see what's going on here. So in Genesis chapter 22, here we've got Abraham. And if you remember, Abraham was the man that God made a covenant with. And he told Abraham that he was going to be the father of many nations. He was going to be a blessing, and that all the countries of the earth was going to be blessed through him. And that there was a lot of different things that were involved in that covenant that God made with Abraham. But it was all tied up in Abraham and Sarah having a son whose name was Isaac. So what we see in chapter 22 is that when Isaac, and I think Isaac was probably like a teenager at this point, but when Isaac was, I believe, a teenager, that God came and tested Abraham. And he comes up to Abraham and he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, in verse number 22, or verse number 2, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. You know, you look at that and you think, wow. But God is testing Abraham to see if Abraham is really going to do this or not. And so what we see is that early the next morning, Abraham gets up and he gets the servants and he gets Isaac and he gets the stuff and he goes. The only thing is, he doesn't bring the sacrifice. He goes and he leaves his servants there, and he and Isaac are going up on Mount Moriah. And Isaac is carrying the wood for the sacrifice. Abraham has got the fire. He's got the knife. And as they get up to the top, Isaac has, got some questions about this. What are we sacrificing, Dad? If he would have maybe thought ahead of it, he would have said, Dad, I'm really sorry for what. No. Okay. But we see that what happens is just as much a part of faith on Isaac's part as Abraham's part, because Isaac never resisted his father. I'm sure that as a teenage boy, he could have done it because Abraham was over 100. And so Isaac is bound. Isaac is laid on the altar. And Abraham is about ready to take a knife and plunge it into Isaac. But all of a sudden we see that the angel of the Lord called out from heaven. And he said, Abraham, Abraham, here am I, he replied. Verse number 12 is where I'm at. He said, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And so there's that test. Abraham, I know, of course God knows everything, but it was more probably for Abraham's knowledge than it was for God's. But I know that you aren't going to withhold your son from me. And what happens is that in verse number 13, Abraham looks up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. Now, in Hebrew, this is Jehovah Jireh. Or if you look in other translations, they'll transliterate the Hebrew into English. They don't translate it. They just simply say Jehovah Jireh. So Jehovah is God, the Lord. And then Jireh is He will provide. It's also He will see. It's that Hebrew word kind of goes back and forth. And so it says, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Or it could also be, on the mountain of the Lord it will be seen, or on the mountain of the Lord he will be seen. Okay? And we're going to come back to that in just a second. Now, I said, another place we're going to go to is Hebrews chapter 11. So let's go on over to Hebrews chapter 11, and let's see a little bit about what factored into Abraham's thinking about all this. So in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse number, 17. Hebrews 11 and 17. It says, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. So here we've got it, okay? We've got the idea that God's promised Abraham all of these things and all these blessings, but all of those things and blessings, which really was Abraham's own salvation, had to come through Isaac. Because through Isaac is going to come the Israelite nation, and through the Israelite nation is going to come the Messiah, Jesus Christ, that's going to provide all of this. And so Abraham's looking at all of these promises that God has given him, but he's also looking at the fact that God just said, go kill the means by which all these blessings are going to come. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't. So how did Abraham reconcile this in his brain? This is how he did it right here. He says this in verse number, as we continued, verse number 19. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And there it is. Abraham was thinking, God is going to provide. Okay? I don't know how God's going to provide, but I know that God is going to provide. Do you see the idea about faith there? And that is the amazing thing about faith. We don't have to understand the details. We just have to understand the end picture, right? You know, I don't know how God's going to work this out, but I know God's going to work it out. I don't know how God is going to save us, but I know God's going to save us. I don't know how God is going to provide, but I know that God's going to provide. And he's thinking of all the different ways that God is going to provide. Even if God has to raise Isaac from the dead, God can do it. And if God wants me to kill Isaac, God is going to provide, even to the point if Isaac is raised from the dead, because I know that Isaac has to stay alive at least long enough to have a kid. Right? You know, after he has a kid, all bets are off. But you know that Isaac has got to be alive in order to have a kid, in order to have keep that lineage going, in order to be the father of many nations. And so in his thinking, he's like, I don't understand what is going to happen, but I don't know God is going to provide. So when Abraham was there at the base of the mountain and the servants were there, he told his servants, you stay here. The boy and I will go worship over there, and we will come back to you. Okay? So there's the idea about how Abraham knew. And so when Isaac questioned him and said, Dad, the wood and the altar here, but where is the sacrifice? Abraham's not saying, son, I hate to tell you this, but no, the only thing he said was, God will provide. God will provide. And God did provide. Okay? And so here we have this type. All right? As we continue reading on down. Figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. The New American Standard translate that figuratively speaking is that he did receive Isaac back from the dead as a type. Okay? And so here is this Old Testament event that occurred, and here is this point that is being made in the New Testament. And the point is that here is Isaac, and Isaac is going to be sacrificed, and that Isaac is going to be raised from the dead. But instead of that happening to Isaac, what happens is that God takes a ram, a lamb, and that is sacrificed in his place. And so here we have Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, who is sacrificed in the place of you and I. And that Jesus Christ has been resurrected, and so therefore you and I have that promise of the same resurrection. Okay? Isn't it a beautiful picture? And a very appropriate picture too. When you start to look at it, you know, there's all kinds of different things that you can take from it. You can take the idea about Abraham's love for Isaac. You can take about Abraham or God's love for his son, right? You can take about Isaac's obedience to his father. You can take Jesus's obedience to the Father. You can look at the provision that God made with the ram. You can look at the resurrection of Isaac and the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that you could take from it. And there's kind of the beauty about a type is that it's a figure that God has given us so that we can take all these different things. And, you know, once we meditate on it, you know, the more that we can gain from it, the more that we can understand it. Okay, you guys got any questions about that?
What was on that mountain?
Moriah, yeah, that's a good question. So Moriah, that is the place where David stopped the angel of that question that we looked at several weeks ago, and that is the place where the temple is built. Okay, and so that mount where that sacrifice was being made, that is the place where all the other sacrifices were made in the Old Testament, which pictured the sacrifice that Jesus made. Glad you brought that up because I was going to mention that.
Like everything in this story really important.
It is. Yeah, it is. It is in fact, if you look at the life of Abraham, this is kind of like the pinnacle of the life of Abraham. When you're reading the life of Abraham in Genesis, it is building up to chapter 22, and then after chapter 22, then the focus begins to shift to Isaac. So, anybody else?
What a faith, right? What a faith. Wow.
I mean, just even if you didn't like the human that you were told to sacrifice, you know, to believe, yeah, if I plunge this knife into them, God is going to provide even to the point of raising them up. Now, do not take from this that, oh yeah, God's told me to go kill. No. This is the only time that this happened, and God physically spoke to people back in those days. God physically did it to Abraham so that we can learn from the story. God is not going to do this later on. If you go and you commit murder, it's on you. You can't go before the jury and say, "Oh, God told me to do it." Yeah. If they come up to me and say, "Hey, Brother Steve, you are kind of, sort of, maybe not really a Bible scholar. Did God really tell him to do it?" I'm going to say, "Nope."